My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. It was 6 in the morning when the first call came through, then another and another. CEOs, venture capitalists, journalists from CNBC, Bloomberg, The Wall Street Journal. My LinkedIn was exploding. Twitter had me trending under 3 different hashtags. And then I saw it. The email notification that made my heart skip a beat, not from fear, but from the sweet, intoxicating taste of vindication. Forbes had published early. There I was staring back at myself from my laptop screen, the cover image sharp and powerful. The headline read in bold letters that seemed to pulse with energy, "Meet Forbes' most powerful entrepreneur under 40, how Maya Richardson built a $200 million consulting empire in silence." But the notifications that weren't coming through were the ones I'd been waiting for. Nothing from Emily. Nothing from David. Nothing from Mom or Dad. Not yet. They were probably still asleep in their perfect suburban home, completely unaware that their biggest failure, their disappointment, their problem child had just become one of the most talked about business leaders in America. I set my phone down and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Chicago penthouse, looking out over the city as it began to wake up. In exactly 24 hours, everything would change. The family that had spent years telling me I was worthless would finally see the truth. And I was going to make sure they never forgot it. If you're invested in this story of justice and want to see how this all unfolds, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me what you would do in this situation. Your support means everything. Now let me take you back to where this all really began. The invitation had arrived by email 3 days earlier. Subject line, "Family meeting Sunday 3 p.m. non-negotiable." It was from my father's personal assistant, Margaret, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he was taking this. Dad never had Margaret handle family matters unless he wanted to establish that this was business, not personal. I stared at that email for a full 10 minutes, my finger hovering over the delete button. I could have ignored it. I could have sent back a polite decline. But something in me, some part that still craved their approval despite knowing better, made me type out a simple response. "I'll be there." The drive to Lincoln Park felt longer than it actually was. Every red light gave me time to reconsider. Every block brought back memories I'd spent years trying to bury. The tree-lined streets where I'd ridden my bike as a kid, always trailing behind David and Emily because they never wanted their little sister tagging along. The park where Dad used to take us on Sundays, spending the entire time quizzing David about his business classes, while Emily complained about medical school applications, and I sat on the bench reading entrepreneurship books they all mocked. The coffee shop where Mom once told me in that gentle but crushing way of hers that maybe I should consider something more stable, more realistic, more suited to my abilities. I pulled up to the house at 2:58. The Richardson family home was a 3-story Victorian that had been featured in Chicago Home and Garden magazine twice. My mother took great pride in that. She'd spent 30 years curating every detail, from the imported Italian marble in the foyer to the custom chandelier that cost more than most people's cars. It was beautiful in the way museums are beautiful. Impressive, but untouchable. A monument to success that felt cold no matter how high they turned up the heat. I sat in my car for those final 2 minutes, watching the second hand on my watch tick toward 3 o'clock. I was driving a 4-year-old Honda Civic, the same car I'd bought used when I first started out. I could afford better now. I could afford a fleet of luxury vehicles if I wanted. But I'd kept the Honda as a reminder of where I'd started, of what I'd built from nothing. And maybe, if I was being honest with myself, as camouflage. As long as my family saw me driving this modest car, wearing clothes from last season, living in what they thought was a struggling artist's apartment, they'd never look deeper. They'd never question their assumptions. And that invisibility had become my greatest advantage. The front door opened before I could knock. My mother stood there already, wearing her anxiety like a second skin. Eleanor Richardson was 62 but could pass for 50 with the help of a very skilled dermatologist and stylist. She was wearing what I'd come to think of as her uniform. Cream-colored slacks, a silk blouse in pale blue, a single strand of pearls. The outfit of a woman who'd spent decades as a professor's wife and had perfected the art of looking appropriate for any occasion. "Maya, sweetheart, come in," she said, and I caught the way her eyes flickered over my outfit. Jeans, a simple black sweater, boots that were comfortable but not fashionable. I saw the tiny crease between her eyebrows, that unconscious expression of disappointment she'd never quite managed to hide. I wasn't dressed for success. I was dressed like someone who'd given up. The living room had been set up like a courtroom. That's the only way I can describe it. The furniture had been rearranged. Instead of the usual casual groupings that encouraged conversation, the chairs and sofa now faced inward, creating a semicircle with one seat conspicuously isolated. My seat. The defendant's chair. Emily was already there, of course. She'd probably arrived an hour early to help set up to coordinate with Mom and Dad about the agenda. My older sister looked like she'd stepped out of a town and country spread. Her honey blonde hair was blown out in perfect waves. Her makeup was subtle but expertly applied. The Armani suit she wore probably cost $3,000, and she wore it with the casual confidence of someone who bought designer clothing the way normal people bought groceries. She was 35 and had accomplished everything my parents had ever dreamed of. Medical degree from Johns Hopkins. Chief of surgery at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. A husband who was a successful attorney. 2 perfect children who attended private school and excelled at everything they touched. She looked up when I entered, and her smile was pure condescension wrapped in superficial warmth. Maya, you made it. We weren't sure you'd come. The unspoken part of that sentence hung in the air. We weren't sure you'd have the courage to face us. Of course I came, I said, taking my assigned seat. Family is important. David arrived 12 minutes late, and his entrance was everything I'd expected. He burst through the door with his phone pressed to his ear, talking loudly about quarterly projections and market volatility. He held up one finger as he passed us, the universal gesture for, wait, I'm more important than you right now. He paced in the hallway for another 3 minutes, his voice carrying into the living room as he name-dropped executives and threw around numbers designed to impress. When he finally ended the call and joined us, he didn't apologize for being late. He simply set his phone face up on the coffee table where we could all see the constant stream of notifications. Look at me, the phone seemed to say. Look how important I am. Look how many people need me. David was 37 and had been groomed for success since birth. Dad had molded him like clay, shaping every decision, every choice, every opportunity to create the perfect heir to the Richardson legacy. Wharton MBA, fast track up the corporate ladder. Vice President of Strategic Development at Meridian Global, a Fortune 500 financial services company. He wore his success like armor, the Tom Ford suit, the Rolex, the perfectly groomed appearance of a man who'd never experienced failure because failure wasn't an option he'd been given. He looked at me and nodded, not quite a greeting, more an acknowledgement of my presence. Maya, that was it. Just my name. No warmth. No curiosity. Just a verbal checkbox confirming I was there. My father entered last, and when David Richardson Sr. entered a room, everyone felt it. He was 65, but carried himself like a man 20 years younger. Retirement hadn't softened him. If anything, it had concentrated his intensity. He'd spent 33 years as a professor of business management at Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management. He'd published 4 books on organizational leadership. He'd consulted for major corporations. He'd built a reputation as someone who could diagnose a failing company in an afternoon and prescribe a cure by dinner. His students revered him. His colleagues respected him. His family feared disappointing him. He stood by the fireplace, his favorite position in this room. It put him above us, looking down with the family photos arranged on the mantel behind him like evidence of his successful legacy. David's graduation from Wharton. Emily's white coat ceremony. My parents' 40th anniversary photo. Conspicuously absent any photos of me after age 18. Thank you all for coming, he began, as if this was a board meeting and not a family gathering. I've called this meeting because we have a situation that needs to be addressed. A problem that's been festering for too long, and it's time we dealt with it directly. The problem. Me. He didn't even have to say it. The way he looked at me, the way everyone's attention shifted to my isolated chair made it crystal clear. Maya, he continued, you're 32 years old. You've been out of college for a decade now. 11 years, I corrected quietly. I left Northwestern 11 years ago. Left, Emily repeated with a little laugh. That's a generous way to describe dropping out halfway through your junior year. I had a reason I started, but David cut me off. We've all heard your reasons, Maya. The opportunity you couldn't pass up. The vision you had to pursue. But let's look at the facts. He picked up his tablet, swiping through screens with the efficiency of a prosecutor presenting evidence. You dropped out of Northwestern where you were on track to graduate with a degree in economics. A solid degree. A foundation for a real career. Instead, you chased some startup dream that collapsed within 2 years. It didn't collapse, I said. It was acquired. David rolled his eyes. Acquired is what successful people say when they mean they gave up and took whatever money they could get. You walked away with what, 100,000, maybe two. That's not a success story, Maya. That's a consolation prize. I bit my tongue. The acquisition had been for $8 million. I'd walked away with $4.7 million after taxes and paying back my angel investors. But I'd never told them the real numbers. When they'd asked back then, I'd been vague. I'd let them assume the worst because correcting them felt like bragging, and I was still young enough to think that maybe eventually they'd ask more questions, show more interest, believe in me without needing proof. Then there was the e-commerce thing, Emily chimed in, her voice dripping with sisterly concern that didn't reach her eyes. What was it, Maya? Some kind of boutique online store. It was a logistics platform, I said. We built algorithms for supply chain optimization. And you sold it for pennies after 2 years, Dad said. I remember the conversation. You called me, told me you were moving on to other opportunities, which is code for failure in every language I know. I'd sold that company for $23 million. The buyer was a retail conglomerate that wanted our technology and was willing to pay premium for it. I'd been 27 years old and had more money in my bank account than most people see in a lifetime. But again, I'd been vague. I'd said the sale was adequate and allowed me to pursue other interests. I'd downplayed it because some part of me was still trying to protect their feelings, still trying not to make them feel like I was showing off, still trying to be the modest daughter who didn't make waves. And now Dad continued walking slowly around the perimeter of our seating area, like a lawyer addressing a jury. You're doing this consulting thing, which, from what we can tell, consists of you sitting in coffee shops with a laptop taking calls at odd hours and claiming to work with clients you won't even name. I work with multiple Fortune 500 companies, I said. I can't name them because of non-disclosure agreements. That's standard in consulting. Or convenient, David said. Convenient that you can't prove any of this. My mother, who'd been silent until now, leaned forward with her hands clasped together in that gesture she always made when she was about to say something she thought was loving but would actually cut deep. Sweetheart, we're worried about you. We see you struggling, trying so hard to make something work that just isn't working. You're 32. Most people your age are established. They have careers, families, stability. You're still chasing dreams, and we can't sit by and watch you throw away your life anymore. I'm not throwing away my life, I said, and I hated how defensive I sounded. I've built a successful business. Have you? Dad asked. He walked over to where I was sitting and stood directly in front of me, looking down. Because from where I'm standing, what I see is a daughter who's wasted a decade on failed ventures and pipe dreams. A daughter who's living paycheck to paycheck, if the modest apartment and aging car are any indication. A daughter who's too proud to admit she needs help. He reached into his briefcase, a leather monstrosity that probably cost more than my monthly rent, or at least the rent they thought I was paying. He pulled out a manila envelope, the kind lawyers use for important documents. He set it on the coffee table in front of me with a weight that felt both literal and metaphorical. What's this? I asked, though I already knew it was nothing good. Open it, he said. My hands were shaking as I picked up the envelope. Inside was a stack of documents, each one making my stomach sink lower. The lease for the studio apartment they'd been covering with a notice of termination in 30 days. The health insurance policy documents showing my removal from the family plan. Bank statements showing the automatic monthly transfers they'd been making to my checking account, $1,000 every month for the past 11 years, with a note indicating the final payment had already been processed. We've discussed this as a family, Mom said, and there was real pain in her voice, but it was the pain of someone doing something difficult, not the pain of someone recognizing they might be wrong. We've been enabling you, Maya. Giving you a safety net that's allowed you to avoid facing reality. We thought we were helping, but we've realized we were just postponing the inevitable. The inevitable, I repeated flatly. You need to grow up, Emily said, and there was something almost gleeful in her voice, a schadenfreude she couldn't quite hide. You need to understand that life isn't about chasing fairy tales. It's about making practical decisions. It's about building something real. I have built something real, I said, but my voice lacked conviction and I hated myself for it. Why was I still trying to convince them? Why did I still care? David checked his phone, scrolling through something, then looked up at me with what he probably thought was kindness. Look, Maya, I want to help you. Really. I've talked to my boss and we have an opening in our project management division. It's a good position. Mid-level decent benefits. $85,000 a year, which I know sounds low compared to executive level, but it's a solid middle-class salary. It's stable. It's respectable. He paused, waiting for me to show gratitude. When I didn't, he continued. I can fast-track your application. Get you an interview next week. You'd be working under me initially, but if you prove yourself, there's room for advancement. This is a real opportunity, Maya. A chance to stop playing business and start actually building a career. Playing business, I echoed, and something inside me cracked. Not broke, but cracked like ice on a frozen lake when the temperature starts to shift. Dad crouched down so he was at eye level with me, a gesture that might have seemed paternal if his eyes had held any warmth. Maya, listen to me. I've spent my entire career studying organizational behavior, leadership management. I know what success looks like. I know what failure looks like. And what you're doing, it's a slow-motion failure. You're deluding yourself and you're wasting the best years of your life on a fantasy. He stood up and returned to his position by the fireplace. I've taught thousands of students. I've seen hundreds of entrepreneurs, real ones, succeed and fail. You know what separates the successful ones from the failures? The successful ones know when to pivot. They know when to admit that something isn't working. They have the humility to accept help and guidance. The failures, they're too stubborn, too proud, too convinced of their own genius to see reality. And which one am I asked already, knowing his answer. You're my daughter, he said, and I love you. But love doesn't mean enabling delusion. You've had your chance to prove yourself. Multiple chances. And every time you've failed. It's time to stop. The room was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. I looked at each of them. Mom with her pity and worry. Emily with her barely concealed satisfaction. David with his condescending offer of rescue. Dad with his absolute certainty that he was right and I was wrong. Is that all? I asked quietly. Dad frowned. Is that all? Maya, did you hear anything we just said? This is an intervention. We're trying to help you. By cutting off my financial support, I asked. By telling me I'm a failure. By offering me a job that I should be grateful for. That's your version of help. It's tough love, Mom said, reaching for my hand. I pulled away. Sweetheart, sometimes the kindest thing you can do is force someone to face reality. I stood up, leaving the envelope and all its threatening documents on the table. Reality, I said. That's an interesting word. Because my reality and your reality seem to be very different things. Don't be dramatic, Emily said. This isn't about different perspectives. This is about facts. You're not successful. You're not stable. You're not building anything meaningful. Those are facts. Are they? I asked, and something in my voice must have been different because they all looked at me with sudden uncertainty. Maya, David started, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Take the job. Prove us wrong. Show us you can commit to something and see it through. Prove you wrong, I repeated, and I felt a smile tugging at my lips, small and bitter. That's interesting. Because I've been proving you wrong for 11 years. You just haven't been paying attention. What's that supposed to mean? Dad asked. I looked at my watch. 3:47. I had a conference call at 4:15 with a client in Singapore. I had a contract negotiation at 6 with a tech startup that wanted to license my proprietary framework. I had a team meeting at 7 with my 83 employees spread across 7 countries. But standing in this living room looking at these people who'd raised me and shaped me and ultimately failed to see me, I made a decision. It means, I said slowly, that you're right. This conversation is long overdue, but not for the reasons you think. I picked up my bag and headed for the door. Behind me, I heard Mom call out, Maya, wait. Where are you going? We're not finished. I turned back and they were all standing now, thrown off balance by my refusal to accept their script. Oh, we're finished. We've been finished for a long time. I just didn't want to admit it. Don't be childish, Dad said, his voice sharp with authority. Slide down. We're going to work through this like adults. Like adults, I said, and I laughed a sound without humor. You want to know what adults do, Dad? They respect each other. They listen. They don't gather information to tear someone down and call it love. We're not tearing you down, Emily protested. We're trying to help you see reality. No, I said, my voice steady, now calm in a way that felt almost dangerous. You're trying to make me fit into your definition of success. And because I don't, because I chose a different path, you've decided I must be failing. It never occurred to any of you that maybe your definition is too narrow, that maybe success looks different than you think. Success has measurable outcomes, Dad said, falling back on his professor voice. Revenue growth, sustainability, market position. Those aren't subjective concepts. They're quantifiable realities. And by any objective measure, you haven't achieved them. I nodded slowly. Okay, you want measurable outcomes. Let me ask you something. What would success look like to you? Give me a number, a specific quantifiable metric that would make you believe I'm not a failure. They looked at each other uncertain. Finally, David spoke. I don't know. A stable company with real revenue. Maybe 1 million in annual sales. Actual employees, not just you freelancing. Something that shows you're building a real business, not just scraping by. 1 million in annual sales, I repeated. Actual employees. Okay. And if I had that, you'd consider me successful. If you had that, Dad said it would be a start. It would show you're serious, that you're building something sustainable. I nodded again, something settling in my chest. A decision made. Then I guess we're done here. I walked out, and this time I didn't stop when Mom called after me. I didn't turn around when David said something about not throwing away their offer. I just walked to my modest Honda Civic, got in, and drove away from that beautiful cold house. But I didn't go home to the studio apartment they thought I lived in. I drove to my real home, a penthouse in the Gold Coast with views that stretched across the entire city. I rode the private elevator up to the 42nd floor, walked into my 4,000 square foot sanctuary, and finally let myself feel the rage I'd been suppressing. I poured myself a Scotch expensive single malt that cost more than they'd been giving me in monthly allowances, and stood at the windows watching the city lights come on as twilight settled over Chicago. My phone buzzed with calendar reminders. The Singapore call. The contract negotiation. The team meeting. My real life, the one they knew nothing about, demanding my attention. But first I opened my laptop and pulled up the draft of the Forbes article that would publish in 48 hours. Maria Chen had spent 3 months investigating my company, Richardson Strategic Consulting. She'd interviewed my clients' executives from Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Netflix, Salesforce, and a dozen others I'd sworn to confidentiality. She'd reviewed financial documents, growth projections, market analyses. She'd spoken with my leadership team, my advisors, my competitors. She'd done her homework in a way my own family never had. The article was titled The Silent Empire: How Maya Richardson Built a $200 million Consulting Business While Everyone Was Looking the Other Way. It detailed everything. The proprietary frameworks I'd developed for organizational transformation. The Fortune 500 companies that paid me 7 figures for my expertise. The 83-person team I'd assembled across 7 countries. The 2 separate acquisition offers of $50 million each that I'd turned down because I wasn't done building. The estimated net worth of $127 million that Forbes had calculated, though the real number was actually higher because some of my holdings were structured to stay private. But more than the numbers, the article told the story. How I'd dropped out of Northwestern not because I was failing, but because I'd landed my first major consulting contract worth more than my dad's annual salary. How my first startup had been acquired for $8 million, not failed. How my e-commerce company had sold for $23 million to a retail conglomerate that wanted the technology I'd built. How every single venture my family had dismissed as a failure had actually been a calculated step in building something extraordinary. Maria had asked me during one of our interviews why I'd kept it all so quiet. Why I hadn't told my family or friends or posted about it on social media, like so many entrepreneurs did. I'd struggled to answer because the truth was complicated. Part of it was strategy. Operating below the radar gave me advantages. Clients valued discretion. Competitors didn't see me coming. But another part, the part I didn't want to examine too closely, was fear. Fear that if I told them and they still didn't believe, still didn't respect me, still found reasons to dismiss my success, it would hurt worse than their current ignorance. But now, sitting in my penthouse with their ultimatum fresh in my mind, I didn't feel afraid anymore. I felt something else. Something colder and sharper. They'd had chances to ask me real questions. They'd had opportunities to look past their assumptions. They'd chosen not to. They'd chosen to see me as a problem, a disappointment, a failure. And that choice was about to have consequences. I clicked open my email and found the message from my PR team. Forbes wants to move up the publication date. Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. Eastern. Are you ready? I typed back a single word. Yes. Then I opened another email, this one from Professor James Chin, my freshman year economics professor and the only person from my Northwestern days who'd stayed in touch. He'd been the first person to tell me I was thinking too small, that traditional academic paths were for people who needed structure, and that people like me, people with vision and courage, needed to forge our own way. He'd become an informal advisor over the years, someone I could talk to about the loneliness of building something in silence, about the isolation of success that no one acknowledged. His email was brief. Saw the final draft. I'm proud of you, Maya. But more importantly, are you proud of yourself? I stared at that question for a long time. Was I proud? I'd built something extraordinary. I'd helped transform some of the most successful companies in the world. I'd created jobs, developed innovative frameworks, made more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. But sitting in that expensive apartment, drinking that expensive scotch, I felt hollow. Because none of it mattered to the people whose approval I'd been chasing my whole life. And that was the truth I'd been avoiding. I'd built an empire partly to prove them wrong, partly to earn their respect. And the Forbes article that would publish tomorrow wasn't just about sharing my success with the world. It was about forcing my family to see me. Really see me. Maybe for the first time ever. I typed back to Professor Chin. Ask me again in 48 hours. That night I barely slept. I kept checking my phone, watching the hours tick down to 6 a.m. My PR team had prepared me for what was coming. The media requests would be overwhelming. My LinkedIn would explode. Twitter would light up. My company's website would probably crash from traffic. But what they couldn't prepare me for was the personal fallout. The moment my family saw that Forbes cover. The moment they realized everything they thought they knew about me was wrong. At 5:45 a.m. I was already awake, showered, dressed in a sharp business suit I'd had custom tailored. I made coffee, real coffee, from beans that cost $40 a pound and stood at my windows watching the city wake up. At exactly 6 a.m. my phone started buzzing. Not from my family, not yet. From everyone else. Caroline, my executive assistant, texted first. Boss, we're trending on 3 platforms. Forbes crashed their own website. Our servers are overloaded. This is insane. Then my CFO. Maya, CNBC wants you on Squawk Box at 7. Bloomberg at 8. WSJ is requesting an exclusive interview. What do you want me to tell them? Then my head of business development. Client requests are pouring in. We have 17 new Fortune 500 inquiries just in the last hour. We need to talk about scaling faster than we planned. I opened my laptop and there it was. The Forbes cover. My face professional and confident with that headline that was already being shared thousands of times. I opened Twitter and saw the trending hashtags. Number Maya Richardson. Forbes influential. Number Silent Empire. Business influencers were already creating content about it. LinkedIn was filled with posts dissecting my strategy. The Harvard Business Review had published a rapid response article titled, What We Can Learn from Maya Richardson's Unconventional Path to Success. And still nothing from my family. I imagined them waking up, going through their morning routines. Dad reading the newspaper at breakfast like he'd done every day for 40 years. Mom checking her phone for messages from friends. Emily getting ready for her hospital rounds. David preparing for another day of important meetings. None of them aware yet that everything had changed. The first crack came at 7:30. A text from Emily. Just 3 words. Call me. Now. I didn't call. I was in the middle of a live interview with CNBC, talking about disruption in the consulting industry, about how traditional firms had failed to evolve, about how I'd built a hybrid model that combined strategic advisory with hands-on implementation support. The host asked how I'd managed to stay under the radar for so long. I smiled and said, sometimes the best strategy is to build quietly. Let your results speak louder than your marketing. After the interview, I had 17 missed calls from my family. Emily, David, Mom, Dad, even my Aunt Susan, who I hadn't spoken to in 5 years. The texts were escalating from confused to frantic. Emily, Maya, what is going on? Is this real? David, we need to talk. This article. Are these numbers accurate? Mom, sweetheart, please call me. I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us? Dad, Maya, call me immediately. We need to discuss this situation. Situation. Even now, even faced with proof, he couldn't bring himself to call it success. It was a situation. A problem. Something to be managed. I didn't call any of them back. Instead, I went to my second interview of the morning, then my third. I had lunch with a potential client, a CEO who wanted to transform his company's entire operational structure and was willing to pay $8 million for my expertise. I had a video conference with my team in Singapore, reviewing our expansion strategy for the Asian market. I had a contract negotiation for a licensing deal worth $12 million over 3 years. It wasn't until 6 p.m., 12 hours after the Forbes article dropped, that I finally responded to my family. I sent one text to the group chat they'd created without me, the one I'd seen screenshots of over the years where they discussed family matters and deliberately excluded me. If you want to talk, come to my office tomorrow at 9 a.m. The address is in the Forbes article. The address listed in the Forbes piece was my company headquarters, a full floor of a premium office building overlooking Lake Michigan. Not a coffee shop. Not a modest studio. A real office with my name on the door, with conference rooms and a reception area, and 83 employees who trusted me to lead them. I didn't sleep that night either. Not because I was anxious, but because I was preparing. I wanted them to see everything. I wanted them to understand with brutal clarity exactly what they'd missed. The next morning, I arrived at the office at 7. I had my team prepare the main conference room. On the walls, I had them mount screens showing our client list, our revenue projections, our global footprint. On the table, I had Caroline arrange physical copies of contracts, acquisition offers, press coverage. Not just the Forbes article, but the dozens of industry publications that had covered our work over the years. Articles they'd never seen because they'd never looked. At 8:55, reception called. "Miss Richardson, your family is here." "Send them up," I said. I stood at the windows looking out over the lake when I heard the elevator doors open. I didn't turn around immediately. I let them take it in. The space, the view, the obvious reality of what I'd built. I heard my mother gasp. I heard Emily whisper something to David. I heard my father's footsteps stop abruptly. Only then did I turn around. They looked shell-shocked. Mom had been crying, her makeup smudged. Emily looked pale, clutching her purse like a shield. David's usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. And Dad, the man who always had all the answers, looked lost. "Thank you for coming," I said, my voice professionally polite. "Please sit down." They sat in the chairs arranged on one side of the conference table while I remained standing on the other. The power dynamic was reversed now. They were in my space, on my territory, facing my truth. Maya, Mom started, but I held up a hand. "Let me speak first," I said. "You'll have your turn, but first you're going to listen." I pressed a button on the remote and the screens came to life. "This is Richardson Strategic Consulting. We have 83 full-time employees across 7 countries. Last year, our revenue was $196 million. This year, we're projected to hit $240 million. We work with 17 Fortune 500 companies, providing organizational transformation, consulting, strategic advisory services, and implementation support. Our client retention rate is 94%. Our employee satisfaction score is 88%. By every measurable metric you asked me to provide, we are not just successful. We are exceptional." I clicked to the next slide, showing my first startup. This is the company I started when I left Northwestern. You called it a failure. It was acquired by TechBridge Solutions for $8 million. I walked away with $4.7 million after taxes and investor payback. I was 23 years old. Next slide. "This is the e-commerce logistics platform you said I sold for pennies. Retail Giant Corporation paid $23 million for the technology. I was 27. I used that capital to start this company. I turned to face them directly. Every single venture you mocked, every risk you said was stupid, every decision you questioned paid off. Not because I was lucky. Because I knew what I was doing. Because I had a vision. Because I was willing to work harder and smarter than anyone else in the room." Maya, Dad said, finding his voice. "If we had known." "You did know," I cut him off, my voice sharp. "I told you. Multiple times. When I left Northwestern, I told you I had a contract. You didn't ask how much. You just assumed it wasn't enough. When I sold my first company, I told you it was acquired. You didn't ask for details. You just decided it must have been a failure because that fit your narrative. When I started consulting, I told you I was working with Fortune 500 companies. You didn't believe me. You called them imaginary clients." I walked around the table, standing closer to them now. "The problem wasn't that you didn't know. The problem was that you didn't want to know. Because if you knew the truth, you'd have to confront the fact that your youngest daughter, the one you wrote off as a dreamer, as a failure, as a problem to be solved, was actually more successful than any of you." Emily flinched at that. "That's not fair, Maya. We've all worked hard for our careers." "You're right," I said. "You have. And I respect that. Emily, you're an excellent surgeon and a dedicated hospital administrator. David, you've climbed the corporate ladder and earned your position. But here's what you need to understand. Your success doesn't diminish mine, and my success doesn't diminish yours. Except you made it a competition. You made it a hierarchy. And you decided I was at the bottom. I pressed the remote again, showing a new slide. It was an email chain. This is from 3 years ago. David, you wrote to Dad about me. You said, and I quote, "Maya is wasting her life. We need to stage an intervention before she hits 35 and realizes she's accomplished nothing." Dad, you responded, "I agree. But you can't help someone who doesn't want to be helped. We may need to accept that Maya will always be the disappointment of the family." David's face went white. "How did you get that?" "You copied Emily on the thread," I said. "Emily forwarded it to Mom. Mom accidentally sent it to me instead of Aunt Susan because our names are right next to each other in her contacts. She realized her mistake and sent me an apology text, but the damage was done. I'd seen what you really thought of me." Mom was crying openly now. "Maya, sweetheart, that was taken out of context. We were worried about you. You thought I was failing," I said. "You thought wrong. But instead of admitting you might be wrong, instead of asking questions, instead of giving me the benefit of the doubt, you doubled down. You gathered yesterday for that intervention. You cut off my financial support. You offered me a job I should be grateful for. You tried to force me into your definition of success because you couldn't see that I'd already exceeded it." I clicked to another slide, this one showing a news article from 2 years ago. This is from Forbes. Not the cover story, but a smaller piece they did on rising consultants in the tech space. I was mentioned. 3 paragraphs. They called me an influential voice in Silicon Valley's transformation. Did any of you see it? Silence. Of course not. Because you weren't looking. You'd already decided who I was, and no amount of evidence was going to change your mind. David finally found his voice, but it was shaky. "Maya, we made a mistake. Obviously, we made a terrible mistake. But you have to understand from our perspective. From your perspective, I was a failure. I finished for him. Yes, I understand that. What you need to understand is that your perspective was based on willful ignorance. You saw what you wanted to see. A struggling sister you could feel superior to. A disappointing daughter who made your own accomplishments shine brighter. A convenient cautionary tale about what happens when you don't follow the conventional path." I walked back to my side of the table, putting distance between us again. "Do you know what yesterday was like for me? Sitting in that living room, listening to you tear apart my life, offer me crumbs and call it salvation. It was like being back in high school when you'd all sit around the dinner table talking about your achievements while I sat there quietly, knowing that nothing I said would matter because you'd already decided I wasn't as good as David, wasn't as accomplished as Emily, wasn't living up to Dad's expectations." "That's not true," Mom protested. "We always loved you equally." "Love isn't the same as respect," I said. "You loved me the way you'd love a lost cause. With pity and worry and disappointment, but you never respected me. You never believed in me. You never thought I was capable of this." I gestured to the screens, to the office, to everything I'd built. "And the worst part, I almost believed you. I almost started to think that maybe I was delusional. Maybe I was just playing at business. Maybe I should take David's job offer and accept that I'd never measure up to the Richardson family standards." I looked at my father directly. "But then I remembered something you taught me, Dad. You used to say that the mark of a true leader is the ability to see potential where others see problems. You wrote about it in your book. Chapter 7. I have it memorized because I read it so many times, trying to understand how the man who wrote those words could be the same man who looked at his own daughter and saw nothing but failure." Dad's eyes were red now, and for the first time in my life, I saw him look genuinely shaken. "Maya, I don't know what to say. I was wrong. We were all wrong. Can you forgive us?" "Can I forgive you?" I repeated slowly. "That's an interesting question. Here's a better one. Can you understand why forgiveness isn't something I can just hand over because you asked for it?" I sat down now across